Welcome, historians, to the history of the everyday. In this week's edition, we shall be looking at coffee. You may think you know all there is to know about coffee, but we shall see. This is another one of those items that is used every single day by millions, if not billions, around the world. I wonder if they actually realize the rich tradition they are participating in. First things first, the discovery of coffee. Now, as legend has it, coffee may have been discovered by excited goats. What does that mean? Well, in actual fact, there's many different accounts of the origin of the beverage of coffee, but this is the one that is most prevalent and most popular. I'm not saying this is definitely exactly the way it happened, but this is the one that is generally accepted. It goes like this. In Ethiopia, there is a goat herder, and he is called Kaldi. Now, one day, around 850 AD, he noticed his goats were acting particularly frisky. They were a little bit energetic after feeding on the ripe berries from a bush that was later to be known as an Arabica bush. Now, after eating these berries, these goats were running around, dancing, moving, and so he decided to try some of these berries for himself and found he had a similar level of energy boost, a similar level of euphoria, meaning lots and lots of excitement and fun. Now, somehow or other, the local monks heard about this particular story and they started to eat the berries themselves. And again, as legend has it, it was a means to help them stay awake during the long periods of prayer. They soon found that once they crushed it and infused it with water, the berries could produce a drink that gave a similar stimulating effect. So you didn't have to eat the raw coffee beans anymore, the raw magic berries as they were known. They first put them into a drink. So the goats discovered the berries, the goat herder discovered that humans could eat them, and it was the monks who added them to water, and it evolved from there. So these so-called magic berries soon spread out across the Red Sea, and it was in the Middle Eastern country of Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula that we reach the next stage of our story. So very, very soon they started to see the benefits of this particular plant and start cultivating the coffee plants and use the berries for not just personal use, but for sale to make financial gain. So this is the first instance of the coffee shop in many ways. Now, one of the reasons coffee might have become quite popular in this region of the world, and particularly at this time, was there'd just been recently the spread of, relatively recently, historically speaking wise, the spread of the religion of Islam, which forbid the consumption of alcohol. So without having alcohol, they needed some sort of other beverage that might be a fun drink to have. So it was where the term the wine of Arabia or Arabian wine originated, which refers to the drink of coffee. Now, it wasn't actually until somewhere between the year 1000 and 1200 that the method of roasting and crushing the bean of the cherry, the so-called magic berry, and infusing it with hot water and what you would call these days coffee could be made. So previously they had made a sort of weird pasty mush. It was only after this discovery that they found what you would reasonably term as coffee today. So why is it called coffee? Well, this is where I'm going to embarrass myself, I think, because it's obviously an Arabic invention. So it was not known as coffee in the region. That is an English word. It was first referred to as, and no, I am not going to attempt to pronounce in Arabic at all. I don't speak Arabic. I'm going to put it out there. But it is still known by this original name in Arabic speaking nations. Now, as coffee and the tradition of coffee moved out of the Arabian Peninsula and through the Ottoman Empire, It sort of evolved into the Turkish word of kahve, and that became the Italian word of cafe, and then the English word of coffee. So it is only the English that call it coffee, obviously. All right. So it became quite controversial. Now, as you can see, in the year 1511, so around 500 years after its common use, it was attempted to be banned by the governor of Mecca in 1511. So there was a meeting they had in 1511, and they had decided that coffee would be banned. Now, this was led by this gentleman down here, the governor of Mecca, a gentleman by the name of Care Beg, and he was afraid that coffee would foster opposition to his rule because it brought a lot of people together. It was a very social drink, and they would sit around talking and they would talk about how terrible their leader was, and he thought that would lead to opposition. And this is also the first instances of coffee being associated with revolutions. More on that to come later. Now, it was decreed sinful, or to use the word haram, but that was not the end of the story. They declared coffee haram, sinful. You're not allowed to have it anymore. Your religion says you cannot have this coffee. But for 13 years, people would not necessarily accept it. They kept challenging this idea, and challenging this idea. Until eventually it was rescinded in 1524 by the order of the Ottoman Turkish Sultan, so essentially the emperor of the Ottoman Empire himself, decreed that coffee was allowed to be drunk again. So the regional governor of Mecca, and Mecca is of course the center of the Islamic faith in much the same way that Jerusalem could be for the Christian faith. So Mecca is a very influential city. So when they banned coffee in Mecca, that spread out across the entire Islamic world. But the Sultan, the emperor of the Ottoman Empire, overruled this decision. And he said, absolutely not. We are allowed to drink coffee. And for his trouble of trying to ban it, they executed the governor of Mecca. So don't try and ban coffee is the lesson to be learned there. People want their coffee. Now, in terms of how it came to Europe, obviously it made its way to Europe via trade and interaction with the Arabic world, with the Islamic world, especially with the Ottoman Empire. Now, there are instances or recordings of coffee being shared between leaders, meetings of leaders during the Crusades, but it wouldn't start making its way into Europe as a regular occurrence, as a regular trading item until much later. So it really only starts taking off in Europe after the 1600s, 17th century, if you will. So coffee was all imported from Arabia at that time. You could not get it from anywhere else. This meant that it was something of a luxury item. It also meant that it would not be drunk every day, and certainly not by the everyday person. Now, because it came from Arabia, it caused a lot of controversy in Europe as well, because it was deemed to be non-European, it was deemed to be too Turkish, too Arabic, too Islamic, against our religion, all of those things. So just as they had had the similar discussion 100 years previous in the Arabic region, whether or not it was allowed by their religion, the same thing happened in Europe. In Italy, many priests were arguing this cannot be drunk, this is a sinful drink. But the Pope himself drank some coffee, loved it, and the Pope, head of the Christian faith, or should I say the Catholic faith, said it was fine, and hence it became accepted. So in Britain and around the rest of Europe, the coffee house became an increasingly common feature in towns, cities, all across Europe, making coffee much more popular. So in terms of going to visit your local Starbucks, that is a tradition that goes back in Europe about 500 years and goes back in the Arabic Peninsula about 800 years. So it's not exactly a new idea. So These are the earliest sketches or pictures of the coffee house in Europe. Now, if you take a look, you may notice there is something they all tend to have in common. Yes, it's pretty much all men in attendance, and not only just all men in attendance, generally speaking, middle and upper class men. It was a wealthy man's drink, generally speaking. Now, in these places, because these are all, well, generally all wealthy men sitting around talking, they're talking about what's best to make money, what's best for the empire, what's best for their country, what's best for their nation. And these discussions started leading to debate. Now, this is very similar to what had been happening in Mecca in 1511, where the governor there had decided, you know what, all these people sitting around talking about politics, that can't possibly be good. And that takes place also in Europe. So the origins of this, obviously, the first time it is described in literature is in Istanbul in 1642. And in Venice, the first coffee house starts in 1645. In England in 1650, and not until 1671 in France. It was also a bit of a slower take up in modern day Germany as well. But you can see, starting in 1650 as the first one, the first location was actually in Oxford, and you can go to that same place today and it is still a coffee house there, which is pretty amazing. That means there's a coffee shop in Oxford that is older than the country I originate from, Australia, which is amazing. And I have sat in that coffee shop and the coffee was okay. It was pretty good. But by 1675, there are more than 3,000 coffee houses throughout England. So that means there are 3,000 places for wealthy people to sit around and talk politics and decide if the king is doing a good job or not, which leads us to the coffee controversy in England. So there was something called the Women's Petition Against Coffee. Now, this is an instance of a particular protest. One of the reasons for this protest was women were excluded from coffee houses. They were not allowed. Now, this is only in England. This was not the case all across Europe, but in England, this was the case. So women were not allowed. That was one of the objections to coffee, was that it was divisive at the time. But also it was the fact that they were so popular, these coffee houses, men would spend more time there than at home. Wives began to argue that they were forever absent from the home and neglecting their domestic duties and turning Turk. Oh my goodness. So you're not British if you drink coffee. How dare you? And all for this black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking, nauseous puddle water. It did not seem worth it. Now, again, this is another example of people who don't drink coffee tend not to like it, or people who haven't drank coffee tend not to like it. In fact, that is what happened with the Pope. As soon as he drank it, he went, oh, actually, no, coffee's not that bad. Okay. Now, what ends up happening here is there was another attempt to convince Englishmen away from coffee because it was turning them to be Frenchified. You are acting French if you drink coffee, even though England had had coffee before France. So that argument didn't make sense. But it was seen to be not British to drink coffee. How dare you? In fact, the king himself banned coffee houses in 1675. So this is King Charles II of England, and he decided a proclamation to end coffee houses and also to absolutely forbid people selling coffee from any sort of shop. So you couldn't even sell it for private use. Now, the argument that he made was that coffee houses disturbed the peace of the realm and promoted defamatory rumor mongering, which was code for people are saying bad stuff about me in the coffee house. So the real reason that he wanted to get rid of these places was because he didn't want them talking politics. People sitting around talking politics and thinking they might accidentally think about him doing a bad job, or they might accidentally think about things they could ask him to do. And so he did not want this happening. Again, with the connection of coffee and the revolution. More to come on that still. But this is the idea that if people sit around thinking about politics, they might start realizing that the politicians are doing a bad job. So the law to ban coffee houses was passed December 29th, 1675, and was due to come into effect January 10th. So you had about 2 weeks to shut down your coffee house. But this law never went into effect. It was abolished on January 8th of 1676. It was banned, or sorry, I should say, the ban was banned. It was blocked by several of Charles II's ministers themselves because they were lovers of coffee. How dare the king try and stop me drinking my cup of coffee? So again, don't try and ban coffee. It's not a popular decision. Okay, now in terms of how coffee comes to influence the world, there is an argument that because of coffee, we have the British Empire. Now, how do you make that connection? Well, it goes like this. During the age of the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, coffee was seen to get people thinking, sharpness, clarity of thought, wake people up. It was seen as the opposite of alcohol. Alcohol tends to depress people. Alcohol tends to get them to stop thinking, whereas coffee does the absolute opposite. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, back in the day, most people drank alcohol in terms of lager or some sort of beer more than they drank water because water was very, very dirty. It was unsafe. Now, if you made beer, the process of making beer would actually purify the water. So the sense that you were better off drinking beer than water if you wanted to stay healthy. The only downside, of course, being that you were drunk most of the time and not very sharp, not thinking very well, not perhaps producing the most. So by drinking coffee instead, where you still had to boil the water and therefore purify it, that meant that people were able to all of a sudden start thinking and be much more productive. So in a way, the coffee fueled the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, and therefore is responsible for everything that came after. So the Industrial Revolution comes out of the Enlightenment, medical advancements come out of the Enlightenment, even YouTube comes out of the Enlightenment. So thank you, Enlightenment, and thank you, coffee. But also, within the British Empire, there are many, many sources of income, of finance, that are all because of coffee. Lloyd's of London began its life as a coffee house. It was only after having all of these wealthy gentlemen meeting in the same spot day after day that they decided to turn it into a company, and it became massive in insurance and banking. That's also true of the East India Company. A bunch of traders, a bunch of people who were involved with shipping were meeting in the same coffee house day after day, and eventually they decided to pool their resources and they created the East India Company, which would eventually come to take over the nation of India, as it were. So the entire expansion of the British Empire can be seen to have its origins in a coffee house. Even the London Stock Exchange began as a coffee house. Wealthy men meeting in the coffee house and saying, "Oh, can I have some of your money to invest into this company?" "Yeah, sure." How much percentage of your company can I get? Blah, blah, blah. Till that expanded so much that it became the formal London Stock Exchange. So coffee houses literally ended up financing the majority of the British Empire. No coffee, no British Empire. That simple. Well, not quite that simple, but the argument can be made. Now, in terms of France, well, very, very similar thing happened. As in London, coffee houses in Paris were meeting places for the Enlightenment. Poets, philosophers, they gathered at certain famous cafes, the Café Parnasse and the Café Procope. Now, I am sure that my French was perfect pronunciation just there. Rousseau, D'Alembert, Benjamin Franklin, and Voltaire were all known to meet at these cafes. Now, whether or not you know those names, I guarantee you, you will come across them. If you ever study the Enlightenment, if you ever study the French Revolution, the American Revolution, these are some of the thinkers that shaped the modern age. Now, Voltaire himself, one of the most noted philosophers, was noted for drinking dozens of cups of coffee per day. And another key difference between coffee in France and coffee in England was in Paris, women were allowed to go into coffee houses. So women in France began to drink coffee as well. Now, where it shapes the nation of France is on the afternoon of July the 12th, a young lawyer by the name of Camille Desmoulins, I'm sure that's perfect, set the French Revolution into motion. Now, what happened was the king dismissed a French minister, the finance minister, known as Necker. Now, he was very, very, very popular with the people, and he was seen as the savior of France because France was having much financial issues, and he was fired by the king. And in response, this young French gentleman pulled out a pistol and jumped up on a table and said, "To arms, citizens, to arms." And this eventually leads to a large mob gathering and storming the Bastille, which by many is seen as the beginnings of the French Revolution. The French Revolution would, of course, go to shape the entire nation of France and, generally speaking, the entire French Empire and therefore Europe. So again, thank you, or perhaps no thank you, to coffee. Now, the spread of coffee. Obviously, it is very, 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 very popular and important in Europe, so much so that it creates a demand for coffee. Europeans need coffee. Now, this particular map that you are looking at is every single nation that was at one stage either formally colonized or formally under the control of a European nation. So obviously that's the nations of Europe, clearly, but they also came to dominate in places like the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, my own country of Australia, and as you can see, all of Africa. Now this map will become even more important as we go through. So almost the entire world comes under European influence. So, of course, what do? They want to go and grow some coffee. So they had all of these lands between these European nations, and they need to supply their people with coffee, so they try to grow the plant. Now, the Ottoman Empire, or at the time, was the only source for grown coffee, and they tried to stop anyone else from growing it, but through some sneaky means, some Europeans, some Dutch actually, were able to obtain some seeds for the plant and shipped it to Indonesia, to a place called Java, and began to grow the coffee for themselves. So many places all through Asia, the Caribbean, and South America were transformed into coffee growing nations. When it came to America, you can see the Americas were colonized and sort of split up between the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the British, with the Russians having part of Alaska. That is a whole nother talk about for another day. But what ends up happening, it gets shipped to North America in 1668. And the first coffee house opens in 1696. Now, following this, it was in 1723 that a French mariner named Gabriel Duclos, and again, I'm sure that pronunciation is perfect, brought a coffee plant to the island of Martinique. Now, when that happened, that coffee plant was spread to other Caribbean islands and to Central and South America. It was in 1727, a Portuguese sailor brought saplings to Brazil, and Brazil is still today the #1 producer of coffee in the world. They make 35% of the world's coffee. So it was incredibly, incredibly profitable and incredibly, incredibly successful for the Europeans. And by the mid-19th century, so the mid-1800s, coffee was one of the most important commodities in world trade. Now, coffee versus tea. This is the big, big controversy, of course. You can see by this chart, by this map, that tea is most drunk through Asia and Russia and indeed in South Africa and Britain, whereas that sort of drops off as you get to Eastern Europe, still very, very popular, and in Australia as well. But by the time you get to Central Europe, you've got about as much people or more drinking coffee over tea. And of course, if you look at the Americas, where they, first of all, grow the most amount of coffee, so of course they drink more. And in particular, the United States, coffee is much more popular than tea. Now, the reason for that is actually very, very interesting. So coffee was first brought to the British colonies, what it would evolve to become the United States, by the British in the mid 1600s, ironically to a place that used to be owned by the Dutch called New Amsterdam, but they renamed it New York. And coffee began to be very, very popular, but tea was still the most favored drink in the New World until 1773. You may have heard of this little thing called the Boston Tea Party, perhaps. That is when they had a revolt against the king. The British needed some money, so they said, what does everyone drink? They all drink tea. Put a tax on tea, we'll make lots and lots of money. This caused an absolute uproar. How dare you charge us for tea? This is terrible. And they switched their preference to coffee. It became a national symbol to not drink tea. So when this American War of Independence broke out in 1776, drinking tea was seen to support the British and the king. You were not a patriot, you were not loyal to America if you drank tea. And Thomas Jefferson, who would go on to become the American president in the 1800s, said, coffee, the favorite drink of the civilized world, which was his way of saying, Britain, you are not civilized, you are not an enlightenment thinker like the rest of us. You are not living in the age of reason. You are a brutal tyrant. So the coffee versus tea debate wasn't necessarily based on which one you actually preferred to drink. It was based on who were you supporting if you drank tea. So it also helped shape another country known as Ceylon, which you might know today as Sri Lanka. Now, not only did it shape Sri Lanka, it also shaped Britain and the British Empire itself. So this location was first settled by the Portuguese and then the Dutch, but it fell into British control in the 18th century, so the 1700s. Always remember, the century is always one more than the date. So the 1700s is the 18th century. Now, they had been growing coffee for a long, long time before they were colonized, because even though the Dutch were the first ones to sort of try and profit from it, cultivate it, they had not introduced coffee to Sri Lanka or Ceylon. Because of its location, it had actually been visited many times by traders from the Arabic Peninsula, which meant they had been drinking or growing coffee for a very, very long time. So the British set about expanding this industry, and they actually started making quite a tidy profit. The Ceylon coffee industry was very, very successful. They managed to export lots of it. However, these days, Sri Lanka is much, much more associated with tea. So much so that this map we're looking at tells us two things. One, how much of the island is actually dedicated to growing tea. But two, this is actually published by the government, essentially. They want to be associated with tea. This is their official stance is we are a tea nation. So how did this come about? Well, in the 1860s, there was a disease that arrived and started to eat away at the coffee plants. By the time they realized what was going on, the coffee industry of Ceylon was destroyed, absolutely ruined. So they had all this farmland that was dedicated to growing coffee, and they couldn't grow it anymore because of this fungus. If you paid attention to last week's edition, you'll notice a similar thing happened with potatoes in Ireland. So they only grew potatoes in Ireland, and a fungus wiped out the plant. It caused absolute chaos. Here they only grew coffee, and a disease affected the plant. They couldn't grow anything else. So they started to plant tea in the same locations, because tea and coffee grow under very similar conditions. So they grew tea instead, and it became very, very popular. So much so that it increased the popularity of tea in Britain. It could be said that tea was actually, while still very popular, perhaps not the most popular drink in Britain at the time, but after it became so available at this stage, it definitely was. By growing tea in Ceylon, which was part of the British Empire, it was a lot cheaper to trade and to get into Britain than buying it from places like China, which meant there was a lot of cheap tea, which meant it wasn't just for rich people and wealthy people anymore. Anyone could drink tea, meaning it became much more popular. So, according to the Mintel Coffee report of 2008, Britons consume 70 million cups of coffee annually, which is a lot. But that same report said they drink 60 million cups of tea a day, which is obviously much more. Now, in India, coffee was also seen as a subtle rebellion against the British. So this is an example of a poster, nationalist poster, nationalists being people who are proud of India. So we see this gentleman, he's a Sikh, he's shown as a fine type, so a classic example of an Indian man, and he drinks a fine coffee. Both are Indian, okay? If you drink coffee, you are Indian, because as we mentioned before, because of its proximity to the Arabian Peninsula, just like in Sri Lanka or Ceylon, they had been growing coffee. They'd been growing coffee in India a long time. Tea was introduced to India by the British. So it was seen that coffee was the more Indian drink. So this was the quote: "The origin of Indian coffee is saintly. It was not an empire builder or a buccaneer who brought coffee to India, but a saint, one who knew what was good for humanity." This was written by R.K. Narayan, who was a famous Indian author. So we can see coffee versus tea, again, starts to become quite the political statement. And this gets revealed with William Uckers, who wrote a book, A History of Coffee, in 1935. And he wrote, "One of the most interesting facts in the history of the coffee drink is that wherever it has been introduced, it has spelled revolution. It has been the world's most radical drink in that its function has always been to make people think. And when people begin to think, they become dangerous to tyrants and to foes of liberty, of thought, and action." So he actually was making the case that where coffee goes, freedom follows. So we saw examples with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, revolutionary fervor or thought or suspicion in Mecca, and by Charles II in England. Now, the cup of coffee has changed a lot over the years. A lot. From eating berries to crushing berries into a paste, to drinking a cold, oily, greasy beverage, it has changed over the years. So before 1000 AD, they used to ground them up, mix it with animal fat to have a nice, delicious drink. Yum. By 1660, people are adding milk to their coffee. Whoa, what a strange invention. By 1822, we've got this thing called the espresso machine, and it is becoming more widely available in these coffee houses, making the preparation of coffee much more concentrated, so stronger, and much faster to make. In 1867, we start seeing the first use of the phrase cafe latte, the coffee with milk, if you will. Even though they had been using milk from 1660, this particular phrase referred to the preparation of that milk, which was steaming it, making it nice and hot and frothy, what you imagine a cup of coffee to be today. In 1900, a company known as Hills Brothers started to pack roast coffee in vacuum tins. And this saw the decline of local roasting shops and coffee mills, because you could store coffee for a long time from one large supplier. In 1901, we get the invention in Chicago from a gentleman by the name of Satoru Kato. the first soluble instant coffee. So the coffee you see on the supermarket shelves in the jars, that was only invented in 1901. And it wasn't particularly popular to begin with. It wasn't until 1920 they had this thing in America called Prohibition, which said no alcohol. Coffee becomes much more popular. That's interesting. This is the same thing that had happened in the Arabic Peninsula over 900 years ago. In 1938, Nestle invented freeze-dried coffee as a method for Brazil to keep up their coffee surpluses, and they invented Nescafe, the most popular kind of coffee on planet Earth. By 1940, we can see America is importing 70% of the world's coffee crop. So America is definitely a coffee nation. The irony, of course, being they make terrible coffee in America. That's a whole other topic. In 1971, the coffee shop as we know it today, as modeled by Starbucks, begins. They had their first store open in Seattle. Now, it is somewhat ironic that Seattle would be synonymous with coffee because you cannot possibly grow coffee there. More on that in a moment. Now, Starbucks was not that particular successful at first, but it slowly grew over time, started to expand through North America, but it wasn't until 1996 they had their first store outside of the USA, which was in Tokyo. Now, funnily enough, revealing my own bias, my own origins in Australia, Australia and Italy are two of the only nations that Starbucks has failed when they've tried to launch there. The only places in the world where they've had to shut their stores because for whatever reason, people do not enjoy their style of coffee there. Quite interesting, I think. Now, in 2015, there was a huge milestone, the first espresso ever brewed in space. So coffee is not just taking Earth by storm, it will eventually take the galaxy by storm. In 2020, I've literally double-checked this 3 times. This seemed ridiculous as a statistic, but it is true. 500 billion cups of coffee consumed by everyone on Earth each year. 500 billion cups. Keep in mind, that is, there's 8 billion people in the world if you include newborn babies all the way through to 120-year-old women in Okinawa, Japan. If you include every single person on planet Earth, that's 8 billion. To get to 500 million, if they all drank 5 cups a year, that's 40 billion. So you've got to times that by 10 for 50 cups a year to get to 400 billion. You can see you're still not there. So this is every single person on planet Earth is drinking coffee without question. I mean, except for the people that don't. But that is an amazing statistic. Now, this is where we need to go into the slightly darker side of coffee, the trouble with glorifying coffee. It has had a positive influence in many ways in the world, but also some downsides. Like most things in history, nothing is inherently good always, and nothing is inherently bad always. There are certain degrees in between. Now, the history of coffee is actually tied to some very major world-changing events, but one of them must not be ignored, and that is the issue of slavery. The majority of coffee in the 1700s was grown on slave plantations. Those examples that I gave of 1723 with the French introducing coffee to Martinique, 1727 with the Portuguese taking it to Brazil, that led to a much higher demand for slavery in those nations. In fact, Brazil was the last nation on planet Earth to make slavery illegal because they relied on it so much to make coffee, and they made so much coffee. So the fact is that Europeans' need for coffee also led for the European need for slaves, which is not great. In Java, a Dutch colony, and this brings us to our author over here, Edouard Dekker. He wrote a novel called Max Havelaar, and he publicly shamed the practices of coffee growers in Java, which was a Dutch colony. Now, this is 1860. Supposedly, Slavery is on the decline and should not be being used. But in his book, he outlines the cruel practices they were using there and declared publicly, "You grow rich from the poverty of others." Now, this is a common theme, unfortunately, with the farming and growth of coffee, which is why the Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, maybe you've seen it around on the supermarket shelves, began because they want people to use ethical farming practices to prevent this dark side of coffee growing. Now, this brings us back to this particular quote, where William Uckers in 1935 was certain that wherever coffee went, people begin to think they had become dangerous tyrants and foes of liberty of thought and action. He believed that coffee was the bringer of freedom, but it's quite ironic because in actual fact, the demand for coffee encouraged slavery, and there can be no worse form of tyranny than that. Now, this is another reason coffee is synonymous with slavery. If we look at this map where coffee grows, there's quite the rule here that it only grows pretty much between 25 degrees north and south of the equator, or between the two tropics, the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. Now, if we look at this particular map, the 70 countries that fall within this so-called bean belt, you will see much of them are in what we would call the third world or the developing world. They are third world nations, still developing economies. And unfortunately, that means they are rife for exploitation. This is where the connection with, shall we say, unethical practices in the farming of coffee can be seen. Now, as I said, they are putting much in place to deal with this particular issue. And these days, I would say, if you are ever going to be purchasing coffee, make sure it is Rainforest Alliance certified to make sure that it is ethical. So, with all of that said, I hope we realize how much coffee has indeed shaped the world. And let's just look at coffee in the present day. So if you were to buy a cup of coffee in terms of its real cost, say you buy this one for £2.20, well, in actual fact, what you are buying is not just a cup of coffee. You are buying the coffee itself, you're buying the milk, you're buying the cup stirrers napkins that are in that coffee shop, you're buying the rent for that coffee shop, or perhaps if they'd that coffee shop had bought the location, you're paying for the person making your cup of coffee and the person taking your order, so the staff costs, and of course any taxes involved and the profit for the company. So everything you're drinking, the milk and the coffee, comes to 16p. Everything else stacked on top brings the price to £2.20 per coffee. So just keep in mind, anytime you're buying something, you are not just buying that thing, you're buying the supply chain that goes with it. You're buying that coffee being shipped from Brazil to London, for example. You're buying the lid, you're buying the cup, you're paying the person to make it for you, all of those things. So please do not fall into the logic trap where people say, oh, it only costs 8p to buy the milk and the coffee, so it should be 16p. Why am I paying £2.20? It's ridiculous, because you are paying all those other costs along the way as well. So if we put this into a long-term plan, there are certain options of getting your coffee. So the coffee shop, or perhaps you've got the coffee machine at home, or perhaps you've got an espresso or the classic stove-top espresso maker. If we look at the actual costs, okay, you might see, well, this one's giving you a cheap cup of coffee for £1.60. So if you get that every workday, that's £8 a week, which works out to £416 in a year, which is £2,080 over 5 years. That is a lot of money. Whereas if you put out to get the espresso machine, for example, you're putting out the first cost of £100, but over 5 years, you are spending 825, a savings of £1,200. So if you literally love your coffee, buy a coffee machine. But you cannot beat the stovetop espresso maker. In my opinion, the best cup of coffee is the stovetop espresso maker. It makes a lovely cup of coffee. With that said, I also have an espresso machine that I cannot start my day without. In terms of advice I would give you, if you do not currently drink coffee, hold off as long as you possibly can. Do not drink it. Do not drink it, because once you start, you will not be able to stop. And as you can see, it might cost you a lot of money over the years. So I hope you have learned something and you realize just how influential a simple cup of coffee can be to the state of the world. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and take part in the quiz. We will see what you have learned. Thank you very much. Speak to you next time.